There is a strange feeling many people share right now, even if they don't have words for it. It's the sense that time itself has begun to compress, that events no longer unfold patiently, one after another, but instead arrive all at once, overlapping, accelerating, pressing in from every direction. News cycles feel breathless. Technologies leap forward before society can absorb the last change. Political alignments shift so quickly that yesterday's impossibility becomes today's headline. And beneath it all, there is a quiet question forming in the background of human consciousness. Why does everything feel like it's happening at the same time? For centuries, those who studied prophecy watched history like stargazers scanning a dark sky. They looked for individual signs, one war, one treaty, one invention, appearing slowly, spaced across generations. A conflict here, a revival there, a technological leap followed by decades of adjustment. That was the pattern. That was how history moved. But what we are witnessing now does not fit that rhythm anymore. The tempo has changed. What defines this moment is not a single dramatic event. It's not one headline or one crisis or one figure stepping into the spotlight. It is convergence. Multiple developments, political, technological, spiritual, cultural, once separated by long stretches of time, are now unfolding together, rapidly, in the same generation. The effect is disorienting, like watching several storms collide into one massive system. Think about how we recognize a storm. Dark clouds alone don't guarantee rain. Wind by itself might just be a passing front. A sudden drop in temperature can be dismissed as coincidence. But when the sky darkens, the wind rises, the air grows heavy, lightning flashes, and thunder follows all at once. You don't debate whether a storm is coming. You know it has arrived. What we are seeing now feels very much like that moment, but on a global scale. This is what many have begun to describe as prophetic convergence. Not prophecy fulfilled in isolation, but prophecy accelerating in harmony. The key distinction matters. The urgency does not come from one fulfilled prediction, but from the realization that the conditions for many long-anticipated developments are aligning simultaneously. The stage is no longer being assembled piece by piece. The stage is nearly complete. Scripture itself anticipated this kind of moment. It did not describe the end as a slow, evenly paced march, but as a time when signs would cluster together, when watchers would be told not to look for a single indicator, but for all of them. The language is unmistakably plural. Not when you see one thing, but when you see all these things. The emphasis is on accumulation, on convergence. Equally striking is the emphasis on speed. Ancient texts speak of knowledge increasing, of movement accelerating, of information spreading rapidly across the earth. For most of human history, those words felt abstract, even poetic. Knowledge increased slowly. Travel was limited. Information was local. But now knowledge does not simply grow, it doubles. Innovation does not crawl, it leaps. Information does not travel, it floods. What once required generations now unfolds in months. This acceleration has a psychological effect. It creates pressure, it produces anxiety, it leaves people with the sense that the ground beneath familiar structures is shifting. Economic systems feel fragile. Political alliances feel temporary. Cultural norms feel unstable. Even identity itself feels contested. And yet, many instinctively resist naming the deeper reason for this unease. It feels safer to attribute it to politics, to technology, to social change. But those explanations, while partially true, do not fully explain why the changes feel so synchronized. Because synchronization is the key. Wars alone are not new. Technology alone is not new. Religious conflict alone is not new. Natural disasters alone are not new. What is new is their convergence, how they now amplify one another, feeding into a single accelerating pattern. Technology reshapes economics. Economics intensifies political tension. Political tension fuels war. War destabilizes regions central to prophecy. And all of it unfolds under the watchful gaze of a globally connected world that sees everything in real time. This is why the current moment feels heavier than past crises. It's not just that something is happening, it's that everything seems to be happening. The margin for delay has vanished. There is no long pause between cause and effect. Decisions ripple outward instantly. Consequences follow almost immediately. Humanity is experiencing a compression of time, and with it, a compression of accountability. Importantly, recognizing convergence is not the same as declaring conclusions. This moment is not about setting dates or naming final actors. It is about discernment. It is about acknowledging that the environment described long ago, the conditions required for certain events to occur, is no longer theoretical. It exists. And once conditions exist, events no longer need centuries to unfold. They can happen quickly. This realization produces two very different reactions. For some, it triggers fear, a sense of doom, a desire to look away or numb the anxiety through distraction. For others, it produces obsession, an unhealthy fixation on identifying villains, decoding timelines, or forcing certainty where humility is required. But there is a third response, quieter and steadier, that this moment calls for. Awareness without panic, urgency without despair, watchfulness without fear. Because convergence, while sobering, is not presented as a threat to those who are spiritually awake. It is presented as confirmation, a reminder that history is not spiraling randomly, but moving with purpose. The same acceleration that brings darkness to the surface also brings truth into clearer focus. The same compression that exposes instability also strips away illusions. This is why this moment feels so intense. Layers are being removed, systems are being tested, beliefs are being clarified, neutral ground is disappearing. In times of convergence, indecision becomes uncomfortable. People feel pressured to choose. What they trust, what they serve, what they believe is ultimately real. And this is only the beginning of the pattern. Convergence does not resolve quickly. It intensifies. Like labor pains, it starts subtly, then grows closer together, stronger, harder to ignore. The early contractions can be mistaken for coincidence. The later ones cannot. They demand attention. They demand preparation. What we are witnessing now is that early recognition moment, the realization that the contractions are no longer isolated, that the rhythm has changed, that the space between them is shrinking. The storm clouds are no longer scattered across the horizon. They are gathering overhead. This is not a message meant to terrify. It is meant to orient, to help you understand why the world feels different, why the pace feels relentless, why the sense of urgency seems impossible to escape. It is because we are no longer waiting for the conditions of prophecy to arrive. We are living inside them. And as we move forward, the question will no longer be whether convergence is happening. The question will be how we respond to it, whether with fear, distraction, or clarity. Because once convergence begins, neutrality becomes difficult. Awareness becomes essential, and understanding the stage that is being set becomes more important than ever. If convergence explains why everything feels like it's accelerating, then the next question becomes unavoidable. Where is all of this pointing? Not toward a finished outcome yet, but toward a structure. something being assembled carefully, deliberately, piece by piece, and nowhere is that structure more visible than in the shifting landscape surrounding Israel. For generations, the idea of a broad peace framework involving Israel and multiple surrounding nations seemed unrealistic. Too many grudges, too much history, too much blood in the ground. The Middle East was defined by stalemate, not reconciliation. Agreements came and went, talks collapsed, and every attempt at lasting peace eventually returned to the same impasse. That long resistance itself became part of the assumption that certain alignments were simply impossible. Then, almost without warning, the impossible began to happen. Long-standing barriers cracked. Public normalization replaced quiet hostility. Nations that once refused even symbolic contact began to speak openly of cooperation, trade, and mutual security. What made this moment remarkable was not just that agreements formed, but how quickly they did. Decades of entrenched positions dissolved in months. Frameworks appeared where none had existed. The atmosphere changed. Yet the most important detail is often misunderstood. These developments do not represent the final fulfillment of prophecy. They represent something subtler, and in many ways more significant: the preparation of a stage. Prophecy does not usually unfold as a sudden leap from nothing to everything. It unfolds when conditions reach a tipping point. For centuries, students of Scripture wondered how certain descriptions could ever become plausible. How could Israel stand at the center of a multi-nation agreement? How could regional hostility give way to coordinated cooperation? How could a single framework involve many while still revolving around Jerusalem? Those questions lingered unanswered, not because prophecy was unclear, but because the environment did not yet exist to support it. Now it does. This is where caution becomes essential. There is a temptation, especially in times of rapid change, to rush toward conclusions, to label individuals prematurely, to assign final roles too quickly. But discernment requires restraint. Not every builder of a stage is the lead actor. Not every agreement is the covenant. Recognizing the pattern does not mean declaring its completion. That restraint is not weakness. It is wisdom. What matters is the framework itself. Agreements involving Israel no longer require unimaginable concessions to become politically feasible. Coalitions once held together by opposition are now reorganizing around shared interests. Economic incentives, security concerns, and regional stability are aligning in ways that override decades of ideological resistance. The logic of cooperation is replacing the reflex of hostility. This shift answers a long-standing prophetic question. How could such a covenant ever come to pass? The answer, it turns out, is not through sudden transformation, but through gradual normalization. Through repeated small steps that make the unthinkable feel ordinary. Through the slow erosion of psychological barriers rather than dramatic ideological reversals. What once required a miracle now requires only the right moment. And that moment feels increasingly close, not because prophecy demands it, but because the groundwork has already been laid. The conversations are happening, the relationships exist, the mechanisms for enforcement, mediation, and economic integration are already in place. The architecture is standing. All that remains is confirmation. This distinction is critical. Confirmation is not creation. A covenant confirmed is not a covenant invented. It is something already shaped, already drafted, already accepted in principle, waiting for the right authority at the right time to bring it into force. That is why the focus should never rest solely on personalities. Individuals come and go, structures remain. From a prophetic perspective, this is precisely how such developments would be expected to unfold. Not through chaos alone, but through order. Not through immediate collapse, but through apparent stability. Peace, not war, is what makes the final conflict possible. Security, not fear, is what lowers defenses. Cooperation, not resistance, is what opens doors that can later be closed. This is why peace frameworks deserve careful attention. Not celebration without discernment. Not condemnation without understanding. Attention. Because peace in prophecy is never presented as purely positive or purely negative. It is presented as strategic. It creates conditions. It reshapes expectations. It redefines what seems normal. When peace arrives suddenly in a region defined by conflict, it is not merely political news. It is a signal that the environment itself is changing. And environments matter more than events. For thousands of years, the environment around Israel resisted alignment. Hostility was the default. Now alignment is becoming thinkable. That alone marks a profound shift. It tells us that history has entered a new phase, one where outcomes once considered distant can now unfold rapidly. This does not mean we are watching the final act. It means the curtain has been raised, the scenery has been set, the audience is seated, the lighting has changed. The silence before the performance feels heavy because everyone senses that something significant is about to begin. What makes this moment particularly delicate is how ordinary it appears on the surface. Treaties are signed, meetings are held, statements are issued, analysts debate strategy, markets respond. It all feels familiar, procedural, almost mundane. And yet, beneath that surface normalcy lies a transformation that would have been unthinkable a generation ago. That is how the most consequential shifts usually occur. Not with explosions, but with signatures. This is why prophecy unfolding fast does not always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks administrative, sometimes it looks diplomatic, sometimes it looks like committees, frameworks, and memorandums of understanding. But speed is not measured only in spectacle. It is measured in how quickly long-standing barriers disappear. And they are disappearing. As we move forward, it will become increasingly important to distinguish between fulfillment and preparation, between actors and architecture, between what has happened and what is now possible. Confusing those categories leads either to fear or to false certainty. Recognizing them clearly leads to calm awareness. The stage is not yet occupied, but it is ready. And once a stage is ready, events no longer need to wait for centuries of preparation. They only need the moment. The convergence we discussed earlier ensures that when that moment arrives, it will not arrive alone. It will arrive alongside many others, layered, compressed, accelerating together. Peace around Israel is not the conclusion of the story. It is the setting. And understanding that difference may be one of the most important forms of discernment this generation can develop. As political frameworks quietly reshape the landscape around Israel, another transformation is unfolding just as rapidly, but far less discussed in mainstream conversation. It does not arrive through treaties or negotiations. It arrives through language, through symbols, through a subtle redefinition of what faith itself is supposed to mean in a modern world desperate for unity. At first glance, the movement appears noble, peace between religions, cooperation instead of conflict, dialogue instead of division. After centuries of bloodshed carried out in the name of God, the idea of shared ground feels not only reasonable, but overdue. Who wouldn't want a world where faith no longer fuels violence? Who wouldn't welcome a future where differences are softened for the sake of harmony? But prophecy has always warned that the most dangerous deceptions would not appear hostile. They would appear compassionate. What is emerging now is not merely interfaith dialogue, which has existed for generations, but something more structural. A framework that treats doctrinal differences not as meaningful distinctions, but as inconveniences to be managed. A framework where truth is negotiable, exclusivity is offensive, and conviction is rebranded as intolerance. The language is gentle, the tone is warm, the implications are profound. The core idea is simple. All paths lead to the same destination. Different names, different traditions, different rituals, but ultimately the same God, the same truth, the same end. Under this view, unity becomes the highest virtue, while disagreement becomes the greatest sin. Peace replaces truth as the central value. On the surface, this sounds like progress, but beneath the surface, it represents a fundamental shift in how faith is understood. Because faith, by its very nature, makes claims. Claims about reality, claims about salvation, claims about who God is and how humanity relates to Him. When those claims are flattened for the sake of unity, faith is no longer transformed, it is diluted. This is where the warning of apostasy becomes relevant. Apostasy is not the rejection of religion, it is the reshaping of it. It is not disbelief, it is belief stripped of its defining core. Historically, the most dangerous spiritual shifts did not come from atheism, but from compromise, from the blending of truth with error until the difference became indistinguishable. The troubling aspect of this movement is not that people of different faiths are speaking to one another. Dialogue alone is not the issue. The issue is the emergence of a shared religious identity that exists above doctrine, above scripture, above exclusive truth claims. A faith that asks believers not to abandon belief, but to reinterpret it, to soften it, to universalize it. In this model, Jesus is no longer the dividing line. He becomes a symbol, a teacher, a moral guide, one voice among many. His uniqueness is reframed as metaphor. His claims are treated as cultural expressions rather than eternal truth. And this is where the shift crosses a line that prophecy explicitly warned about. Because the defining claim of Christianity has never been that Jesus was wise or compassionate or influential. It has always been that He is the way. Remove that claim, and what remains may look like faith, but it no longer functions as such. It becomes spiritual language without spiritual authority. What makes this development particularly significant is its speed. Ideas that would have been openly rejected by mainstream Christianity just a generation ago are now discussed openly, even celebrated. Major institutions endorse language that prioritizes unity over doctrine. Leaders speak of shared worship, shared prayer, shared spiritual destiny. The infrastructure for a global religious identity is not being hidden. It is being inaugurated. And again, this is not happening in isolation. It is unfolding in parallel with political realignments, technological acceleration, and cultural pressure toward conformity. The same forces that demand political cooperation now demand spiritual cooperation. The same logic applies. Difference is dangerous, conviction is disruptive, unity is stability. Prophecy described this moment not as sudden rebellion, but as a falling away, a gradual drift, a soft departure from truth that feels like progress rather than loss. Churches do not empty overnight. They change tone. Language evolves. Emphasis shifts. The exclusive becomes inclusive. The uncomfortable becomes optional. Over time, the faith that remains bears the same name, but no longer carries the same weight. This is why the warning matters now. Not to provoke fear, but to sharpen discernment. A one-world religious framework does not announce itself with threats. It arrives with invitations. It does not demand renunciation. It offers redefinition. It does not persecute immediately. It persuades first. And persuasion is always more effective when people are tired of conflict. In a fractured world, unity feels like relief. After centuries of religious war, compromise feels like wisdom. But peace achieved by erasing truth is not peace. It is quiet. And quiet, in prophecy, often precedes control. This is not about rejecting cooperation or compassion. It is about recognizing the cost of unity when truth becomes optional. Because once faith is reduced to shared values, rather than revealed truth, it becomes easily managed. It can be reshaped. It can be merged. It can be mobilized. And that is precisely what makes it useful to a future system that requires not just political compliance, but spiritual alignment. This is why the emergence of a global religious architecture matters so deeply. Not because it fulfills prophecy outright, but because it removes obstacles. It normalizes the idea that doctrine divides and unity saves. It prepares hearts to accept a faith that asks for allegiance without conviction. The most unsettling aspect is how familiar it feels. There are no warnings, no alarms, no overt hostility, just progress, just tolerance, just peace. And yet, beneath the language of harmony, something essential is being quietly set aside. Truth is being reframed as preference. Conviction is being treated as extremism. And faith is being reimagined as a tool for global stability rather than a relationship with the living God. This is not the final form of what prophecy warned about, but it is a necessary step toward it. The foundation must be laid before the structure can rise. And once people are accustomed to unity without truth, they are far more willing to accept authority without discernment. The convergence continues. Political stages are set. Spiritual frameworks are forming. And the direction is becoming clearer, not through spectacle, but through subtle, accelerating alignment. While religious language is being softened and political frameworks are being normalized, another structure is rising quietly in the background, one that does not appeal to belief or conviction, but to convenience. It promises efficiency, security, order. It does not ask people what they believe. It simply asks them to participate. And that is precisely what makes it so powerful. For centuries, certain prophetic warnings were difficult to imagine in practical terms. The idea that a single system could control who is allowed to buy and sell across the world felt unrealistic. Economies were too fragmented, borders were too rigid, technology was too limited, power was too decentralized. The mechanism simply didn't exist. Now it does. What has changed is not human nature, but infrastructure. The modern world is being rebuilt around digital identity, centralized verification, and programmable systems. Individually, these developments are presented as solutions to practical problems: fraud, inefficiency, crime, exclusion. Together they form something far more consequential: a unified mechanism of access. Access is the key word. In the past, participation in society was assumed by default. You existed, therefore you participated. You could trade, travel, work, and survive largely outside centralized oversight. Today, participation increasingly requires authorization. An account, an ID, a verified profile, a system that recognizes you as valid. Without it, everyday life becomes difficult. With it, life becomes seamless. This shift has happened gradually enough that most people barely notice it. Physical documents gave way to digital records. Cash gave way to cards. Cards gave way to mobile wallets. Mobile wallets now connect to biometric confirmation. Each step feels logical. Each step promises safety. Each step is optional, until it isn't. What makes this moment significant is that these systems are no longer experimental. They are operational. Digital identification frameworks are being rolled out at national and supranational levels. Financial systems are transitioning toward programmable currencies, money that can be tracked, limited, approved, or restricted based on policy. Transactions are becoming conditional, not just transactional. In such an environment, the ancient warning about buying and selling stops sounding symbolic and starts sounding procedural. This is not about a mark appearing overnight. It is about a world being conditioned to accept that access must be earned, verified, and maintained. That participation is a privilege managed by systems, not a right exercised by individuals. Once that mindset takes hold, enforcement becomes easy, compliance becomes normal, exclusion becomes justified. Technology accelerates this acceptance by removing friction. Convenience becomes the persuader. People do not resist systems that make life easier. They resist systems that feel intrusive. The brilliance of modern control mechanisms is that they often feel like upgrades. Faster payments, seamless travel, personalized services, reduced risk, increased efficiency. But efficiency has a cost. When systems know who you are, where you are, what you buy, what you believe, and who you associate with. Control does not need to be aggressive. It only needs to be selective. Access can be adjusted quietly. Privileges can be paused. Participation can be limited. All without spectacle, without force, without public confrontation. Alongside this economic infrastructure, another layer is emerging: perception control. This is where artificial intelligence enters the picture, not as science fiction, but as amplification. AI does not create deception on its own. It magnifies it. It makes falsehood scalable. It makes illusion convincing. It allows images to speak, figures to appear alive, realities to be simulated with unsettling realism. What once required mass belief now requires only technical plausibility. For generations, descriptions of powerful deception were read as metaphors. Signs and wonders were assumed to belong to a supernatural realm beyond human imitation. Today, technology can reproduce experiences that feel indistinguishable from reality. Voices can be replicated, images can be animated, presence can be simulated, authority can be projected. This does not require belief in technology as evil. It requires recognition of its neutrality. Technology amplifies intention. In the wrong hands, it does not merely deceive, it overwhelms. It floods the senses. It collapses skepticism. It creates an environment where truth must compete with experience, and experience often wins. This is why deception is described not as simple lying, but as delusion, a state where people believe what feels real rather than what is true. In such a state, discernment becomes difficult. Emotional response replaces critical thought. And once people accept a system because it works, not because it is right, resistance fades. What is striking is how seamlessly these layers align. Economic systems require digital identity. Digital identity integrates biometrics. Biometrics connect to access. Access connects to compliance. Compliance is reinforced by perception. Perception is shaped by information. Information is filtered, curated, and increasingly generated. None of this requires a villain. It only requires momentum. And momentum is already present. The world is not moving toward control because people desire oppression. It is moving toward control because people desire order. stability, predictability, safety. In times of uncertainty, systems that promise certainty gain trust. The more chaotic the world feels, the more attractive centralized solutions become. This is why these developments matter prophetically, not because they force belief, but because they remove alternatives. When participation depends on alignment with systems, dissent becomes costly. When survival requires access, conviction becomes negotiable. And when truth conflicts with convenience, convenience often wins. The ancient warnings did not describe a world dragged unwillingly into control. They described a world persuaded, a world that accepts a system because it solves problems, a world that trades freedom for functionality without realizing the exchange. We are not yet at the final expression of this system, but we are well past the point where it seemed impossible. The machinery exists, the habits are forming, the logic is accepted. All that remains is integration. And integration, like everything else in this moment, is accelerating. This convergence of technology, economy, and perception does not announce itself with alarms. It hums quietly in the background of daily life. It feels normal, reasonable, necessary. And that is precisely why it deserves careful attention. Because once systems like these are fully embedded, reversal becomes nearly impossible. Participation becomes expectation. Expectation becomes requirement. And requirement becomes law. The storm does not arrive with a single clap of thunder. It builds, it gathers, it surrounds. And by the time the rain begins, the sky has already changed. As the structures of politics, religion, and technology accelerate together, it would be easy to conclude that the story is moving toward darkness alone. War rumors grow louder. Persecution increases. The pressure to conform tightens. The birth pangs intensify. And yet prophecy never presents the final season as a simple descent into chaos. It presents it as a contrast, darkness and light rising at the same time, each becoming clearer, sharper, harder to ignore. This is the part of the story many people miss. While systems of control grow more sophisticated, something else is spreading just as quickly. Not through institutions, not through governments, not through centralized power, but through people. Ordinary, often unseen, often persecuted people. The message of the gospel is moving faster now than at any other moment in human history, reaching places once thought inaccessible. For centuries, the idea that every nation, every people group, every language could hear the message of Jesus felt unrealistic. Geography was an obstacle. Language was a barrier. Borders were closed. Communication was slow. But the same technological acceleration that enables control has also removed those barriers. Information crosses borders instantly. Teaching reaches into homes that missionaries never could. Scripture is translated, shared, and accessed in regions where physical Bibles were once impossible to obtain. This creates a paradox. The same age that enables deception also enables revelation. The same networks that spread falsehood also spread truth. The same compression of time that accelerates darkness accelerates light. Reports continue to emerge from places long considered closed. Stories of underground churches growing, of faith spreading quietly despite pressure, of people encountering Jesus in ways that defy expectation. Dreams, visions, questions stirred in hearts that no institution orchestrated. The spread is not loud, it is not centralized, but it is persistent. Prophecy anticipated this too. Not only the rise of opposition, but the expansion of witness. Not only the increase of deception, but the outpouring of the Spirit. The final season is not described as a time when faith disappears, but as a time when lines are drawn more clearly than ever before. Neutrality fades. Comfort is challenged. Decisions become unavoidable. This is why the intensity feels personal now. The convergence we've been tracing does not remain abstract. It presses inward. It asks each individual where they stand, not politically or culturally, but spiritually. What anchors them? What they trust when systems shift? What remains when distractions are stripped away? And this is where the tone of the story changes. After all the warnings, after all the acceleration, after all the convergence, the instruction given to believers is surprisingly calm. Not panic, not obsession, not withdrawal, but clarity, watchfulness, confidence. The message is not be afraid, but be awake. Fear thrives in confusion. Awareness dissolves it. When you understand why the world feels unstable, the instability loses some of its power. When you recognize patterns rather than fixating on personalities, anxiety gives way to discernment. When you understand that history is moving toward something, not unraveling randomly, chaos becomes context. This does not mean life becomes easy. Pressure will increase. Choices will become more costly. Faith will require courage. But it does mean that fear is no longer necessary, because the story does not end with systems or leaders or technologies. It ends with a return, with restoration, with resolution. That is why the final instruction is always the same. Keep your eyes fixed on Jesus, not on the Antichrist, not on global systems, not on timelines or speculation. Those things matter only insofar as they point somewhere else. The danger of the final season is not persecution alone. It is distraction. The temptation to stare at the storm so long that you forget the anchor. As the world grows louder, faith must grow quieter and deeper. As pressure increases, focus must narrow. As systems promise security, trust must be placed elsewhere, not in resistance for its own sake, but in relationship, not in fear-driven urgency, but in steady obedience. This is the balance prophecy calls for: urgency without panic, awareness without obsession, courage without arrogance, hope without denial. The convergence we are witnessing is real. The acceleration is undeniable. The stage is set. The systems are forming. The contrast is sharpening. But none of this is meant to overwhelm those who are watching with clear eyes. It is meant to prepare them. Preparation does not always look dramatic. Often, it looks like quiet decisions, simplifying life, removing distractions, reordering priorities, choosing truth when it is inconvenient, choosing faith when it is costly, choosing trust when the world insists on fear. And then, resting. Resting not because nothing is happening, but because you understand what is happening. Resting because you know that history is not slipping out of control. Resting because you know who holds the final authority. Resting because you know the end of the story, even if the middle feels intense. So if the world feels faster, heavier, more urgent than ever before, it is not because everything is falling apart. It is because everything is coming into alignment. The storm clouds are gathering. The labor pains are intensifying. The stage lights are coming up. But the same voice that warned of these things also said not to be afraid. Stay awake, stay grounded, stay focused, and above all, stay anchored, not in systems that promise control, but in the one who promised to return. And as the noise of the world grows louder, let that truth settle quietly, steadily, reassuringly in your heart.